So we did see what was going on in how homestay farmers around the world are kind of bonding together and creating value-added products, also in making money together, and they are also making connections. And I also want to mention that farmers have been manipulating the genetics of plants to produce bigger seeds, fruits, and leaves. They also use cross-pollination or selection, and they select and save the seeds. And in the following year, they actually grow them. And so that's done over multiple generations until you get this new variety of corn that has really very high amounts of yields. And that's what farmers have been doing for thousands of years. And when we say plants are plastic, because it's okay, it's you have to remember that plants have a huge amount of plasticity because of just the amount of genetic variation. And if you look at the picture over here, this plant, this brassica plant, and how from this brassica plants utilizing different traits, we have Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, kohlrabi, that comes from your leaf, your buds, and also your stems. And also kind of remembering that it really does take a long time for some of these plants, and it really does take a lot more work for certain types of plants. For example, vanilla orchids are pollinated by one species of bees. And so the farmers cannot really do the pollination themselves, and they have to wait for the bees to do it. Also, for rice, on the other hand, it's very difficult to conform to the changes that the farmers would like to see. So when you talk about super rice, they have an increased yield, and the only reason to and we've only seen this increased yield, since the 1960s. Actually, there has not been any significant improvement still now. And these higher yields are more than 5 times per acre. So for example, when we talk about, wheat, yes, the yield potential has been growing steadily in about 1%, but the dramatic gains are really very small. Basically, in terms of the genetic variability, we have really used up all the gains that we can get from wheat. And so really we just are seeing very, very small incremental increases in the amount of yield. And we need to kind of look at how we can use resources more efficiently. And this really looks at, how, especially in terms of climate change, what things can be done to help to improve that increase in yield to be able to feed the expanding population. Also, what I want to actually mention here is that if you remember, we have two different kinds of farmers. We have the small scale and we have the large scale farmer. And when looking at this diagram in terms of sustainability, when we look at industrialized farming, they do provide a lot of cheap meat. And to an extent, it does provide a few jobs, but not that much as it relies more on equipment. Also, what we notice is that industrialized farming really uses a lot of inputs and it can be really expensive. They also need huge amounts of land and a huge amount of antibiotics that is being used. And we see that increase in antibiotic resistance in the amount of nitrates in the water. We can also look at problems like deforestation and looking at the amount of subsidies that the governments are paying large-scale farmers. We do not see the same subsidies going to smallholder farmers. It's going to farmers that practice monoculture, industrialized farming, utilizing just heavy inputs and causing the environmental degradation. And we can also notice that in terms of the amount of fossil fuel that is being used, and it's so much more higher in your large scale farming. Also, the labor exploitation that happens in your concentrated animal farming operations, when in the slaughterhouses, and kind of looking at the poor working condition. But when we look at small farming, on the other hand, we see the usage of manure. They are using natural fertilizers. They do not, there's not much pollution. We do not notice deforestation because they really do care about the environment. It's also when talking about the animals that they use, it provides multiple functions, not just for labor, but it also provides transport, it also provides food. And when we talk about producing cattle sustainably, we have to look into carbon capture because you cannot just produce cattle sustainably by just looking at genetics, modifying its genetics, and using technical improvements, we're not going to be able to produce it sustainably because of the amount of methane that's being released from your cattle. So we really need to look into growing cover crops. We need to be looking into using green manure as it's pushed down when your animals are trotting the land. And that's when you see your carbon, instead of being released into the atmosphere, it's contained in your soil. And that's what we really want, to be in tune with the local environment and how we can actually limit the amount of usage of resources. And that is the whole what step 3 is all about, using your resources more efficiently. Also, in terms of increasing your total factor productivity, we want to keep farmers on the land, and we need to have tools that anchor them. And usually we use technology in ensuring the land is optimal for cultivability, and also addressing the urgency of climate change. Because as we grapple through some of these challenges, we notice that it's difficult for farmers, especially with limited resources and limited financial capabilities, and also having very limited access to financial assistance, to quickly adopt to these different types of farming, using different types of crops. And it's not impossible, because we have seen that in certain countries like Costa Rica, they have managed to grow crops in an agroecological method. But what we also know is that to be able to grow these crops that are resilient in drier conditions, farmers need to have some form of assistance. Virtually, some of the past challenges in the 1970s are really very much different from what is currently happening in 2023, 2024. We also see, in terms of pests and diseases, that has really changed from those time periods. In terms of your seed preservation, if you kind of look at what's going on in the papaya industry right now, there's a virus that's really devastating the crops. And some farmers in Thailand and Vietnam have gone back to organic farming. We also see, when you start transitioning over to a new method of farming, the first couple of years, you're going to have that reduced profits. Even when we talk about Sri Lanka, when they went into organic farming, it was actually a financial crisis that was going on, and the government did not have enough money to purchase fertilizers. And so it was a sudden and abrupt decision, and many farmers didn't have the time to learn about the process, and that really impacted the amount of food and the yield that they could actually produce. And at the end of the day, the government still had to import those food supplies. So when talking about organic farming, there is a real push, and it's a good thing, because we are driven by the desire to reduce chemical usage, to minimize toxicity, and to address ecological concern. And whether or not you're using GMO, CRISPRs, heirloom varieties, we do see that resistance among farmers worldwide, driven about concerns of these ecological impacts, particularly using your GMO crops. And we also need to kind of look at whether the emphasis on alternative crops and how we can expand our diets and explore new varieties. And if you remember, we had about 300,000 wild plants, and now we're only down to about 4 plants that provide most of our energy. So regenerative farming really does emerge as a beacon of sustainable farming and sustainable practice, particularly among smallholder farmers. And when we talk about farming in general, it has to do a lot with your land. And a lot of this land has already been degraded, but there are technologies that can be used in terms of precision farming to enhance soil quality, and also to improve, really make that strategic investment if farmers are looking into buying land, to elevate their nutrient levels and productivity again. So the emphasis on using technology rightly and carefully, balancing advancements with ecological considerations, and promoting farming that is not just economically viable, but also ecologically responsible. And that moves us on to our next point, which is the shift in our diets. It could be, when talking about moving to a vegan diet, it could be the simplest, easiest, and the hardest thing to do. Because if you look at what's going on right now, it's based on individual choices. And farmers are driven by the desire to do farming to support the type of life, the type of quality of life that they want. And so when they want to make that shift, there has to be a demand for vegetables. But what we know is that instead of the demand for increased amount of fruits and vegetables, we have a higher demand for your animals, particularly your meat. And when we talk about the majority of the meat that is being produced, a lot of it is coming from your soybean and from corn. And so it's something that when talking about growing constantly and talking about the increasing population size, we also need to factor in that there's going to be an increased demand for meat. And what are we going to do in order to increase that productivity? Are we going to increase the amount of corn, grains, and soybeans to feed your cattle? And we also need to look at, I mean, all this land that's being used just to grow your corn, your soybean, and your grains, but a lot of it is not going to humans. We also need to look at why your meat is really cheap. And a lot of it has to do with developed societies, and this actually comes down again to the fact of your subsidies. A lot of your cheap processed food, the government pays huge subsidies, and the cost is really hidden in the taxes. So when we talk about meat consumption, it's really increasing in the developing world. And we're talking about people wanting to get healthy and kind of looking at alternative food sources. And we really do have to reduce our meat consumption in order to reduce our food-related emissions. And when we do that, we would see a drop by about 70% by 2050. And this was a study that was put up by Oxford University, and the savings that could be made would be around $575 billion. And when we look at the amount of emissions that come about, from your cattle, the amount of emissions of methane, that's about 80 to 120 kilograms of methane. And it's basically, due to the amount of burping that cows do. And there are about 250 million dairy cows right now, and it just utilizes a lot of land and utilizes a lot of resources. And moving to a vegan or a vegetarian diet would really help to reduce the amount of inputs and resources that is needed. Also, when kind of looking at this a meat eater's diet, and it's putting a lot of pressure on rising sea levels because of the greenhouse gas emissions. We also see a lot of coastal areas, particularly have just a lot of water, that is and we know that about 1/3 of all the islands around the world are going to be submerged as your ice in the Arctic and Antarctica starts melting. Also, when we talk about just your amount of carbon emission, to grow your cattle, basically we need 17 times more land, 14 times more water, and 10 times more energy. But if you go to a vegetarian diet, a lot of the world's land that is being used for growing feed can be used to feed humans. And we see that about 68% of our about 5 hectares of agricultural land currently is being used for livestock. And with that increasing demand, how are we going to keep up? And remember that all of this is just really very resource intensive. So when kind of looking at this picture again, we see that the amount of energies that is actually used by cows to build muscle, basically when you actually feed a cow, only 10% to 15% of that is converted into muscle tissues. And that is basically the food that we consume, that is basically your meat. And the amount of input that goes into it, the rest of it comes out as your feces or, water after the cow processes the feed. And what happens in your meat packing plant? A lot of the livestock basically, it's just a lot of waste that is really very, very toxic, and a lot of antibiotics that is being used because of just how closely all these cattle and these chickens are actually bred. We also see again this kind of reiterating the point of how much water is being used. And what I really want to kind of talk about this over here is that even when we use like precision farming, we can, especially when land and soil has been degraded by industrialized farming, we can actually use technology to help improve the soil quality. And instead of growing soy and corn, we can actually grow different kinds of crops. And we also see that, a lot of times people are really hesitant to try plant-based food products because it does not contain any meat. And so that's why we also see that rise these days of a lot of industrialized hamburger patties, alternative like vegan nuggets, vegetarian nuggets, and all these alternative forms of food. And when we look at, the typical Mediterranean diet, and I did talk about this, 70 to 80% of their food is actually plant-based material. And if we look at also what is going on in the blue zone area, again, they are just consuming high amounts of plant-based food product. And especially when looking in terms of climate change and how are we going to transition to a vegetarian or a vegan diet, we need to kind of, maybe start making small changes. So maybe start by being flexitarian and kind of reducing that consumption in meat. And that's what this study is about. If you look at worldwide food intake, we see that increase in China, we see that in the US and in the UK, the amount of meat consumption is actually decreasing. And from the 1960s, we see the upward projection. Basically, in China, they used to consume a lot of pork, but then they had a problem with swine fever that affected their pork production. And so they had to destroy all the animals, and basically that is what drove your pork prices up. And the African swine fever really just kind of put an additional strain on people on the people in China because they had to spend a lot more money. And so during that time, particularly during COVID, a lot of them started shifting to consuming beef because it was a lot cheaper. And they started experimenting with using beef. And we really see that, that the consumption of chicken as well is not as high as the amount of chicken consumption is still high, but the amount of beef consumption is actually has been increasing by about 11% each year. And during COVID, a lot of as they started experimenting with using meat, also the marketing and advertising industry, when kind of promoting meat, was promoting it in the sense that meat was much more healthier alternative compared to pork. And so, that really kind of changed that whole trajectory, and we start to see that that increased consumption of beef, particularly in Chinese among the Chinese in China. And so, whether or not that nutritional info was true, whether beef is healthier, that was actually irrelevant, but that really caused that change and that transition in diet. And when we talk about the fifth step, okay, it's basically how we can reduce waste. Basically, from post-harvest to storage, we see that in terms of different types of food, a lot of it can be lost in the field, can be lost during drought, pest disease, and natural disasters. So food loss basically happens in that where, in that early stage of that production process. And so during your harvest, your storage, harvest to before it's being sold to your consumers. And when we talk about food waste, on the other hand, it's when consumers have already purchased that food and then they do not consume that food, it gets old, it gets thrown out. And that's a real problem. 40% of the world's food is lost between post-harvest and consumer stages. And sometimes, it could, like I mentioned, it could also be due to your natural disasters, droughts, and also pests. And we really need to look into how we can reduce the amount of food loss and food waste in order to align with our Sustainable Developmental Goal 12, where we have responsible consumption and production. So this is a diagram that I got from the World Resource Institute, and it's called the shift wheel. And basically how we can instigate a shift towards a more nutritious diet, we have to consider drawing parallels with the challenges of dietary habits when contemplating agricultural practices. So raising awareness about the issues embedded in the current food system is crucial for the success when we need to emphasize the benefits and advantages of adopting a healthy dietary choices to motivate change. We also need to recognize the need for minimally disruptive approach, acknowledging that it's unrealistic to expect everyone to abandon familiar habits. For example, if you're consuming Doritos and Coke and your sugary soda, people are not going to actually change that because they are kind of locked into the system. Typically, when we talk about farmers, a lot of farming equipment, the established practices, and the kind of technology that is being used. So it's been very hard to actually break free from that. And so we need to actually shift the focus to different crops and kind of looking into different kinds of agricultural practices, even though it can be daunting. And especially when, for farmers, smallholder farmers, because their primary concern here is to feed their family. And so when we are talking about this, we have to implement systems that seamlessly integrate with the existing equipment and practices, and also minimizing disruption. So changing societal norms is a key aspect of this transformation. Instead of abruptly stopping habits like frequenting fast food change, try to gradually look at ways and how we can increase the benefits of healthy alternatives, increasing awareness about positive dietary changes through educational programs, and also ensuring the success of initiatives. And we can look at the school lunch programs around Europe, where they are working together with kids to make healthier options palatable. And this really kind of involves repetition and gradual increase of certain types of food groups. For example, keep on introducing salads instead of nuggets and pizza. And that was done in Norway and Finland. And they started to introduce insects and really kind of reinforcing that different kinds and kind of altering that social norms. So it's a gradual process that relies on that constant positive reinforcement over time. And when we look at your climate-driven events, we also see that in terms of changing diets and agricultural systems, we see that from 1960s to now, we have been having problems like diseases, droughts, floods, extreme weather events, hurricanes, and wildfires. All of this is going to happen, especially when we talk, and climate scientists have already expected this. And what we see, particularly when we grow in Wisconsin, what I understand right now, it's supposed to be really cold, but it's almost spring-like weathers. And I was reading an article that people were really excited to go ice fishing, but that was not possible because of the lack of snow. And finally, I want to touch on this desert locust and how it's really impacting huge parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East. We see swarms of this desert locust throughout this area, and it's a species of grasshopper, and they really have a very interesting kind of biological cycle where they produce underground and then they die. They have a finite life cycle, so they lay their eggs and underground, and the young individuals cannot fly. But then they live and they reproduce in small population. And if there's a change, for example, an extreme drought, um, they will something happens in their population, and they basically shift from not being able to fly to moving in a swamp, and that is really very difficult to control because basically when they move, when they start flying, that physiological changes that happen brings about, just how they become converted into these migratory locusts. So basically, these flying grasshoppers, and they do devastate thousands and hectares of land. And it's as devastating as your wildfires. And basically a single swarm can remove about 2,400, about 930 square miles, an area the size of Moscow. And it really, has caused there are about 200 billion locusts. And this is the biggest invasion in Ethiopia, Somalia in the past 25 years, and even in Kenya. And it's really very, very hard to kind of, kill them. And we kind of, because scientists have been using GIS system helicopters, try to look for the swarms and they try to spray them before they reach the adult flying stage, but they can really they move to a new location each time, and kind of remembering that when you're practicing aerial sprays, it's very, very hard to control the wind patterns. And so when they become mature, they really start flying as a group, and that's difficult to control. And it's one of the major issues that we're going to be dealing with in terms of climate change, And so just kind of remembering the 5 steps that we talk about when we are talking about feeding the growing population. And with that, I'm going to end here.